My name is Sanja Lončar. I work as an assistant professor at University of Zagreb, Croatia, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. The title of my presentation is S.O.S. for Vernacular Traditional Heritage in Croatia. It sounds dramatic, but I really believe that this current moment and situation asked for dramatic change in the way we approach preservation of vernacular built heritage in Croatia. This is endangered heritage in permanent crisis, especially in the context of pandemics and natural disasters, floods and earthquakes. I argue for a new approach which would be strategic, inclusive and sustainable and regionally specific. In order to argue this statement, I will present basic information on existing issues and challenges in preserving wooden vernacular architecture in Central Croatia. I will just make a short note about the terms I use in this presentation. So vernacular architecture is a term used internationally to denote the indigenous, tribal, folk, peasant and traditional architecture, to describe common buildings of given place and time, simple traditional structures made of local materials and following well-tried forms and types. We usually talk about domestic, agricultural, industrial, sacral and other buildings. However, in national Croatian context, the terms rural architecture, traditional architecture, folk architecture are used rather than vernacular. In Croatia, traditional architecture varies depending on characteristics of regions. Traditional wooden architecture is characteristic for a wider area of Central Croatia. However, the largest concentration of most valuable wooden architecture is located in several micro-regions, Banovina Banija, Pokuplje, Turopolje and Posavina, where natural environment have ensured high-quality oak and chestnut wood. These are regions where I have conducted research from 2007. I proposed this lecture before earthquakes, but now it's presented here in a totally new context. In mentioned region, the wood is used for building a variety of buildings, such as residential buildings, sacred buildings, chapels, as you see it here on these photographs, and also agricultural buildings for housing animals, for storing cereals, and so on. These wooden buildings are mostly built in the second half of the 19th and throughout the first half of the 20th century. Rarely they are built in the 18th century or first half or beginning of the 19th century. Number of these buildings are still used for housing. Also, they have been converted into office spaces, exhibition spaces, and tourist accommodation. But these examples of converting traditional architecture for new purposes are still rare and concentrated in certain locations or certain areas, for example, in a park of nature, Lonjsko polje. This heritage is numerous. We find it as on individual locations, for example, that are individual buildings or households, but also there are a number of preserved villages or complexes with bigger number of buildings. It is important to say that only small part of this built heritage is listed and it's inscribed in National Register of Cultural Goods. For example, that are only 10 villages and around 50 individual buildings and households in Sisak-Moslavina County. This means that most of this heritage is what I would say out of system. That means without legal mechanisms and developed models for safeguarding. Today, traditional wooden architecture is endangered heritage. It's neglected, left to decay and gradual extinction. And in same Next slides, I will present some of the main reasons for that. Number of buildings have been destroyed over time due to deterioration of materials, fires, abandonment of certain buildings, war activities, and so on. Also, number of buildings have been altered thanks to possibility of dismantling and moving. Changes in rural landscape and gradual disappearing of traditional architecture have occurred more intensively after the Second World War and have continued until today. During the decades, some villages have lost their visual identity, as you can see it on these photographs. Important devastation of wooden heritage happened during the Croatian War of Independence. The region I talk about was part of the occupied territories, and on these territories, huge war damage on cultural heritage has been recorded. Some of the villages lost their wooden architecture completely in that period. War activities in the 1990s had a number of negative impacts on this region that consequently have caused the crisis for vernacular built heritage. First of all, war activities caused migrations, loss of inhabitants, economic stagnation, etc. There is a huge decrease in the number of inhabitants. And for example, here you can see numbers for Sisak-Moslavina County, where this decrease is quite large from 287 to 145,000 inhabitants, which means that more than 100,000 inhabitants left this area. And this had a huge impact on towns and villages. Number of abandoned buildings appeared, but also abandoned towns and villages. And this phenomena has correlated with a number of economic, socio-cultural, environmental, and other issues. And this has become one of the poorest areas in Croatia. So how is this connected with wooden architecture precisely? So you can see some of these images, and you can see how it caused a number of empty and abandoned wooden houses and agricultural buildings, but also it caused changes in landscape, mainly forestation of village areas and appearance of vegetation. And of course, this caused other problems that are thefts of wooden architecture that appear in empty and isolated villages, but also trend of selling houses and agricultural buildings as building material. There are a number of online ads advertising, selling, and buying old quality wood. Recently, additional problems in preserving wooden architecture have appeared as results of natural disasters. Due to time restriction, I can't talk much about huge floods in 2014, but I will say something about the consequences of earthquakes. Wooden buildings have responded, let's say, quite well to earthquakes. However, different damages have been recorded on wooden buildings, especially those that combine building with brick and stone. And the problem that actually exists now is the fact that there is a big number of abandoned and empty buildings that have damages but won't be taken into account in a process of reconstruction and revitalization in a post-earthquake period, because they are not listed and not part of any register. There are, of course, people that use this current situation for demolition and selling houses and agricultural buildings as building material. Also, this situation attracted interest in wooden architecture, but I would say that this interest is more focused on building new wooden architecture rather than using, converting, and saving existing traditional architecture in this region. And also there are a number of proposals and already constructed buildings that, although use wood, don't respond on local and regional building traditions. For end of this presentation, I will just make some conclusions and give some recommendations. So vernacular traditional architecture is numerous and important element of identity in different Croatian regions, but existing system of preservation and protection of cultural goods in Croatia is not effective and adequate for vernacular traditional architecture. And there is a need for new approach that would give new framework, including improvement of legislation, new financial models, more available professional help, and different models of education. This means that we need to implement international recommendations for preservation of vernacular architecture and rural landscapes in order to preserve ambient and regional identity. This new approach should be rooted in interdisciplinary research, analysis, and valorization. It should be strategic, inclusive, and sustainable, regionally specific, and it should respond on specific needs of local communities. I advocate for regional strategy for wooden architecture that would come from systematic interdisciplinary research, from data, from analysis and valorization, in order to make registers with all existing buildings and structures, catalogs with traditional typologies and details, which would help us to define strategic goals and to develop adequate approaches and models, recommendations and measures for existing and for new wooden architecture in this region. Therefore, we have opportunity to make a new framework that would ensure long-term plans, management and investment plans, that would ensure financial models and supports, more professionals working in this area, as well as different models of formal and non-formal education. With these activities, I think still that we have possibility to preserve a larger number of buildings, as well as ambience and regional identity of this architecture. Thank you very much.